on Friday. So I'm not going to steal my own thunder by telling you all about it. I'm going to make you come, and the first message is that one. But some of the other stuff here we'll talk about, and so this is going to be very, very informal. Why don't we look at a couple of scriptures to start with? And in fact, I'm going to hand out some verses for you to read. Somebody can look up 2 Peter. Wait a sec. 1 Peter 2:11. 1 Peter 2:11. And then somebody else, okay, Carl's got that one. Somebody else, 2 Timothy 2, verses 3 and 4. Sharon's got that one. Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 and 16. Nate's got that one. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. Rossby's got that. 2 Corinthians 6, 7. 2 Corinthians 6, 7. And Pastor Nate's got that one. 1 Thessalonians 5, 8, and 9. Heather's got that one. And that'll be it for right now. So, who's got 1 Peter 2:11?
Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul.
So that word wage war is a Greek word that means to mount a campaign or to carry out warfare. And, Peter's using that. The concept of war is, you find it for the first time in Genesis chapter 14, and it runs all the way through Revelation. So when we finally get to the eternal state, we're confident there's no more warfare. But, from the fall of Adam and Eve, when sin entered the human race, and as soon as people began to multiply on the earth and get organized, there was probably warfare very early on. Selfishness, pride, greed, and so on. So the first warfare that we know about is the kings of the east coming to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 14. But probably there was war before then, very, very early on. Abram is about 2100 BC. So warfare has been around. Here, this word abstain from these things because they wage war against the soul. These lusts, these drives and desires that the old nature has, they are mounting a campaign against us. And Peter warns us about that. Okay, it's 2 Timothy 2, 3, and 4. Who's got that? Sharon.
No hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier.
So, a good soldier of Christ Jesus, and Paul is emphasizing a good soldier is not concerned with civilian affairs. A good soldier is separate from the civilian population because he's got a job to do, and that is to defend his home and country. And Paul is using that to say to us, don't be entangled in things that are going to distract you. Materialism, greed, all that other stuff out there. Keep your focus on your commanding officer. Quite often in Roman times, and even down to sort of modern times, the guy who recruited you into the army becomes your commanding officer. That was true in the Civil War here in New Hampshire. So there was a guy, Cook might have been his name, who raised a company from New Hampshire. Now, I don't know if anybody from Conway went down, but they set up an encampment outside of Concord. And then they went down, they were involved in Gettysburg and all kinds of battles. So the recruiting officer becomes the commanding officer of that unit. That's what Paul's talking about. Okay, Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 and 16.
Message to Pergamum, and to the angel of the church in Pergamum, write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this. 16. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth.
This sword, the word for sword here, is a pretty rare word. It only occurs a handful of times. Here, possibly, it does occur in Luke chapter 2, I think. Remember Simeon talking to Mary in the temple. A sword will pierce your own heart also. This word is the word, do I have a screen? It's the word Ramphia. And I spent, this is a little personal thing, this word intrigued me so much, I spent 25 years trying to figure out what it was. I wrote to museum curators. I wrote to the museum curator in Athens, Greece. I talked to an archaeology professor at Tufts University who claimed to know what this was. I bought every book I could find on the subject. I thought I knew what it was up until a few years ago when I collected a few more books about the Roman troops in Dacia and the Thracians. And they actually have found archaeological remnants of the Ramphia. I had thought it was a pole arm. So this is going to be a long thing like a pike, like 12 or 15 feet long with a hook on it. That's not what it is. So it is a straight or slightly curved blade, and the blade portion of it is about 30 inches long, and then it's got a tang and a handle or a haft, and that also is about 30 inches long, and it's got a ring on it because the Thracians would carry it on their shoulder. It had a loop around their neck. And so 30 inches is about like that. And it could be slightly curved, but it could also be straight. And this is a ferocious, the Thracians by the ancient peoples were seen as a very ferocious, very, very warlike people. The Thracians were feared. So the Ramphia is this very special weapon, and it's used in just these handful of places, and it appears to be for effect. You know, it's kind of like saying, you know, I'm coming after you with a tank. It's like, I'm serious about this. I mean business when I'm talking to you.
Just on a side note, I think they did one of those Forge and Fire.
I think you're right. I think I've heard that too, yes. So very, very interesting. Next we've got 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. Who's got that?
For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ.
So much of what we're going to do during SFM is going to be out of Ephesians chapter 6, the Christian's armor and that kind of warfare. Anybody remember what the key activity, the key command is in Ephesians 6? What does the commander say to do to the Christian soldier in Ephesians 6? Put on, and then having put on, what are we supposed to do? Stand. Stand. So the picture is of warfare out in the field, and you've got a defensive line, and the enemy is coming at you, and victory is going to be not conquering new territory, not going after the enemy out there, but standing right here. I am not moving. You can come at me with all you got, but I have God's armor, and I am protected, and I'm going to face you down right here. So it's standing. So that's, you know, that armor. But in 2 Corinthians 10, it's a different kind of warfare. Paul is talking about an enemy that is going to surround a city or a fortress, and the technical term is you reduce it. You reduce a fortress, or you reduce a city. That doesn't mean you make it smaller. That means you take it apart. You knock it down. Any defensive structure is reduced to rubble. And the Assyrians were really, really good at this. There are actually carvings on rock walls. You can see them. They were cut out of the walls and taken to London, the British Museum. I got a chance to see them when I was over there. And another group of people who were really, really good at this were the Romans. So this is a mock-up, a scale model of a Roman siege tower. And this would be used to reduce a fortress or reduce a city wall. And you can see it's got several levels. So these are, 10 feet or 12 feet. There'd be ladders inside. This would be covered. So, there's no wall here so you can see inside. But there'd be ladders to get up to this level, another one to get up here, another one to get up here. Some of you can't see it, but there's a big ash dowel protruding from the front. That's a battering ram. And the guys on the lowest level, it's suspended by ropes or chains, and the front end is either it's a log, or they might shot it with bronze or iron so that it can beat against the lower courses of masonry in a wall. Sometimes they would put kind of a wedge metal shape on the front of it, and they would try to find the seam in the stones and not just drive it in, but then back and forth to try to move the rocks apart, and eventually you get the wall to collapse. But that's not all. Why is it this high? Because the city wall is maybe about here. And so guys up on the top course can do what? Fire down with arrows and spears and so on. Now, of course, this is being built in the field, and the people in the city are watching it. So while this is being built over the course of several days or a week or 2 or 3, they have to make everything. They have to cut down trees. They have to either bring in or make the wheels. While all that is going on, the people in the city are going to do what?
Prepare, but they're also gonna be very frightened.
Well, yeah, they'll get frightened. They'll try to build up the wall here, make it higher, and reinforce behind it. Bring in sand and dirt and rocks, even tear down houses and pile up against this so that it's reinforced. So it's an arms race. Now, this has several wheels. It has 8 wheels down there, and the wheels are taller than a man. They're 8 or 10 feet in diameter. How do you move this thing? This is all big timbers and lumber and wood. It weighs tons and tons and tons. How do you move it?
Do those wheels roll?
They roll. So at night, there is squads of men that run out ahead of it towards the city wall, and they pound giant pins into the ground, and the pins either have loops or pulleys on them. What are they going to do? So one end of the rope goes back to the front here. The other end of the rope goes back there. Several, 100 feet, 200 feet. And then they get teams of oxen, and they hook them to the ropes, and the oxen are pulling that way because it's using the pulley to pull it forward. Why not just have guys out here and they get on the ropes and why not do that? Because the guys in the city are shooting them all the time. Why is this covered with leather? These are cowhides.
So it won't burn.
So these are cowhides because the people in the city are shooting not just arrows, but flaming arrows. And so one of the jobs of the guys inside is they have a bucket brigade. They're carrying buckets of water up to the top and dumping it over the front all the time. And then, of course, what they're hoping to do is to lower the ramp onto the top of the city wall. And when the defenders of the city have been chased aside by arrow fire or spear or fire, then they lower this onto the city wall, and you've got a couple hundred guys running off let's see, somebody's got 2 Corinthians 6:7. Who's got that?
In the word of truth and the power of God, by the weapons of righteousness, for the right hand and for the left.
Weapons of righteousness for the right hand and the left. Can't be dogmatic, can't be certain on this. This might be a reference to gladiator combat. The wording is very unusual. Weapons of the right hand and the left. Roman legionnaires normally had a shield, that shield over there, that's normally in their left hand, and a spear, a pilum, or a veritum, or sword is in their right hand. So the weapons of the right hand and left, very unusual. There is one kind of gladiator called a rhetari, who was known as the fish man, because in his left hand he had a net, a net with weights around the edges, and in the right hand he had a trident, a fishing spear, and he was supposed to go out and have combat with other gladiators. So I can't be sure, but it would be interesting if Paul had seen gladiators in combat in various cities where he had been, and he's using that as an illustration here. Can't be certain, but that's a possibility. 1 Thessalonians 5:8-9.
But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ.
So, not as well known as Ephesians 6, but here is a reference to Legionnaire's equipment. And so the breastplate is it's called the lorica segmentata. This contraption right there, the shoulder gear, and then hanging from that, the hoops that go around. That's the lorica segmentata, and that's the breastplate. And then Paul references the helmet too. The helmet there, the salvation, I don't think it's eternal life. I think it's probably the rapture. It's probably we're going to be out of here before the tribulation starts. That's probably what that is. So there are lots and lots and lots of references to warfare, military equipment, military tactics throughout the Bible, including even the Lord Jesus. He used an illustration about a king going to war, and he says, wouldn't a king kind of think in advance, how many soldiers do I have? Do I have enough money to pay for this campaign or not? So lots and lots and lots of references to warfare throughout the scriptures. Let me show you some of the sword replicas that I've got. So this is everything I've got here except for two little pieces are reproductions. They're not authentic. But this is as authentic as I could get it, taken from museum measurements and so on. And I had a bronzesmith cast the blade from a pattern that I had made. And so the grip is ebony, it's held on with brass pins, and this is bronze. This is called a khopesh, and it's an Egyptian blade. So the Egyptians, we think of them as a very mighty army, and they were, but they're also very, very conservative because they didn't actually have as much contact with other armies as you would think. They were sort of isolated. The ancient Egyptians were kind of isolated. How were they isolated? So the desert, the Sahara Desert is on the west, and on the east you've got the Nile. So there's not as much contact. So if they got an idea that worked, if they had a weapon or a system that worked, they stuck with it. So this was used, this pattern was used from around 2800 BC to about 1300 BC. So like 1,500 years. The design, the basic design for their sword didn't change. This is probably, it looks like a scythe, but it's sharpened on the outside rather than the inside. And it probably is descended from a battle axe. It's more related to a battle axe than it is to a sword. So a khopesh, this is called. When the Jews got into the Promised Land, starting in the book of Judges and running all the way through 1st and 2nd Samuel, their arch nemesis, who was the people group that caused the most problems for the Jews? Philistines. This is a replica of a Philistine sword, wooden grip, and what kind of metal did the Philistines have? What did they work in? Steel. The Philistines were among the first people in the Middle East to master the art of carburizing iron and turning it into steel. So the Jews still had bronze. And in fact, the Jews took their plowshares and their farm implements to the Philistines to have them sharpen them, because the Philistines had metallurgy skills that the Jews didn't. So steel, not just iron, but steel, is far, far superior to bronze for edge-holding capability and hardness and so on. So this is a fairly accurate, it's mild steel, so it would never hold an edge, but a fairly accurate dimensional replica. There are reliefs, carvings, and pictures of the Philistines fighting against the Egyptians and others, and they had kind of a funny shaped figure 8 shield out of either wood or wicker, and then they had these funny horsehair headdresses, blue and red and like that, probably psychology to look ferocious, but their manner of attack was terrifying. They held their shield, and then they advanced at the enemy with their swords over the top of the shield, pointed at their enemy's eyes. Yeah, so pretty ferocious. So the Philistines, among the first peoples in the Middle East to master working with iron and steel. And it really, 1000 BC, in the Middle East is kind of the dividing line between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Moving on to about 700 BC, we're looking at a mock-up of an Assyrian sword. Short sword, intended for stabbing. Many weapons can be used dual purpose, but most of the time they're designed either for slashing on the edge or stabbing. This is a stabbing design. And this is not real ivory. This is Corian, countertop material. But it looks like ivory. There we go. So the Assyrians, what do we think of when we think of the Assyrians? Cruel, fierce, nasty warriors, par excellence. They destroyed the northern kingdom, 721 BC. So Samaria and the 10 northern tribes, gone. And there are reliefs, again, carvings, pictures of the Assyrians taking the Jews captive, leading them off towards the east and sending them north and all over the place. And the manner of captivity is horrific. Soldiers captured in battle, and probably civilians too, arms tied together at the elbow behind their backs, and a nose ring piercing their septum with a chain to the next guy in line. And they go off into captivity. So that's 721 BC. So here's a mock-up of a Babylonian sword. The grip could be leather, bone. Camel bone was a favorite object for grips. Leather, wood, ivory sometimes. And you can see it resembles sort of a modern saber maybe a little bit related to a scimitar. And again, they do have steel technology by now, so all of these now are steel. So this is 586 BC, Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar's armies, and so on. This is the weapon that they used. So this I bought, I didn't make this. Think 400, 300, say 330 BC. Somebody really famous. Alexander the Great. This is a Greek hoplite sword. Steel, wood grip. I think the grip could be other materials too, but kind of a leaf-shaped blade. Sharp. It wasn't even their for many of these. The sword was not their favorite weapon. It was not their favored weapon. Instead, it would be something more like Carney's got here. These things. We'll talk more about those during SFM. But why spears instead of this? He's 6 feet away instead of 2 feet away. You'd like that. So that's why spears are a preferred weapon. So a Greek hoplite sword around 300 BC or so. And this is, you can see there's a similarity with the Greek, and there was cross-pollination. So sometimes these armies would fight each other, and they would say, you know, those guys, they had great weapons. And they'd try to copy them, or they'd capture weapons, or whatever. I'll give you a clue, see if you can guess. Paul wrote to a group of churches, and he challenged them about their views on the law. And the people who inhabited that region in their past would have used this kind of a sword. The Galatians, and the Galatians are Gauls, and they're Celts. This is a Celtic sword. So the Celts were a civilization that stretched all the way to Russia in the east and all the way to England and Scotland. Some of us probably are related to Celts. You know, probably we have Celtic background in a lot of our blood. So a Celtic sword. Do you have any questions on any of those things? Siege tower, yeah.
Did they just leave that, or did they take it to the next battle and just build it and lock it?
Good question. So Sharon's question is, did they, when they're done with it, did they just leave it? Or did they take it apart and transport it? And the Romans, I think that they were among the best and the first at mass production. So I think that they probably had like standard pieces. The wheels especially would be hard to make. And I believe that they did transport as much of it as they could. Now, if they got to a city and they discovered, you know what, we have 3 of these siege towers, we really need 5 of them, they would build more there. But I think that they did. So the Legionnaire, they had a whole, they had a kitchen, they had medical officers, they especially had blacksmiths who were expert at repairing armor in the field. So they would travel with the troops, and if somebody came back and said, my shield got smashed, or I've got a really bad dent in my helmet, well, they repair it in the field. So they were really good at making stuff like that. I think that because that would be a very intensive kind of thing to make, they would try to save it, take it apart, and save it for the next campaign. Yeah. Other questions?
Celts were also known to be particularly vicious.
They were, they have a reputation of being very, very bloodthirsty. and they could be really ferocious in battle. A lot of what we know about the Celts comes by way of Julius Caesar, who fought against them in Gaul and France, and he didn't like them at all. And so his take on them is kind of biased. They were probably fairly civilized, but they sure did know how to fight. Yeah, absolutely. So let me take just another minute. Any other questions? Something that interests you? Yeah. So they set the pins in the ground at night because they didn't want to get shot. But they would pull it towards the city wall at whatever time. So then they're in trouble. And it's a continuous arms race because if the defenders of the city hear this hammering noise at 2 a.m, and they're trying to see what is going on, what's happening out there, and they figure out they pounded pins into the ground, great big stakes. It had to be, I don't know how long they'd be, but they have to be really long to haul something like that. Well, what's the defender going to do? Well, they're going to try to sneak out at night and cut the ropes if they can, pull the pins out if they can, even better, go around back, kill all the oxen. So it's an arms race. They're always thinking. And if they could, if this was not well guarded, then the defenders sneak out at night and they've got flint and tinder and oil, and they light a fire inside of it, try to burn it down. So, that's what it's an arms race. Other questions? Let me show you one more thing. So many, many years ago, I started making a replica of a chariot, and I got the felloes, the sections of wheel cut out. That's as far as it got. I was so intimidated. Making solid wheels is a real art form, and it's probably way over my head. But a chariot was a huge, a very important weapon in the ancient world, psychologically as well as militarily. And the chariot was not really used as we think of it in movies and books, where they get in a line and they say, okay, let's go get them. They ride straight at the enemy and they're going to mow them down. It doesn't really go like that. The chariot was a mobile firing platform where they would go off on the flanks. And if you had 50 or 80 or 100 chariots on this side and 50 or 100 over here, and you had guys with spears and bows and a quiver of 25 or 30 or 50 arrows, you would launch those in volleys on the flanks of the enemy formation, on the sides. And the enemy is so taken up with watching the chariots and the archers over here, they kind of forget the infantry is coming at them from the front. So this is a mock-up of, it's really Mongolian or Turkish. The Turkish bow of the 1700s through the early 1900s is a fairly direct descendant of the ancient Asiatic bow that would have been used by the Scythians, and the Scythians are mentioned in the Bible. Scythians were a people group from Russia. And the Scythians and other people, including the Assyrians, perfected the art of making a compound bow, or I should say composite. Composite is what I'm looking for. So a bow that's made from a single piece of wood is called a stick bow or self bow, but a bow that is made of different materials is a composite. It's got different pieces in it. So they knew how to take, for example, the sapwood of a tree and cut it in a certain orientation and glue it up with the heartwood of a certain tree in a certain orientation and wrap it with bark and leather, and the ends were quite often animal horn. And when you combine all this together, you have a bow that is unbelievably powerful. They weren't necessarily huge. When we think of bows, we often think of like the English longbow, Battle of Crecy in the 1400s, 6-foot long yew bow. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something this size, or maybe even a little bit shorter, but it can shoot an arrow incredible distances. There is a British ambassador who went to Turkey in the mid to late I'm going to say like 1880. He was invited to a festival, and he got to watch some of the contests that they had, and one of the contests was men using their favorite bow and shooting flight arrows. Now, flight arrows is an arrow designed to fly as far as possible, so it's not a combat arrow. But he watched and he wrote in his diary what he saw, and he actually got permission to go measure. The distances are like unbelievable. 800 yards with a bow and arrow. 800 yards is a super duper long shot with a 7mm high-powered hunting rifle. 800 yards is a long, long ways away. Now that's optimum conditions with a specially designed arrow and so on. But this guy measured it. So archery in the ancient world was not, when we were kids, when we played cowboys and Indians, run around with a little rubber thing, and we're not talking like that. We're talking like these things are lethal. In fact, I do have I have just 2 authentic antiquities. This is a Roman bronze arrowhead excavated in Israel, and it dates to between 50 and 100 AD. So just after the time of Christ. It could have been used against Jews in the 70 AD revolt. I don't remember where it is in Israel. I'm going to pass it around. So it's a bronze arrowhead, and this is real. This is, authenticated and all the rest. And then this is a bronze dagger that I purchased. It's from Luristan, which is northern Iran, and I think it predates the Persian Empire by quite a little while, maybe 2000 BC or something like that. So pretty old bronze, so before iron technology. And if you look carefully, you can see 3 rivets that would have attached it. So it doesn't have much of a tang, not too much of an attachment point, but the handle would have been here. This kind of fastening is not real strong, but it is apparently what they used at that time. So this is an authentic one. If you want to take a look at it, I'll just put it up here and come up and take a look afterward. So, do you have any questions about anything? Oh, I didn't show you the machinery. I don't know if we're going to set up the catapult or not. I'm missing some threaded rod that held pieces together. If we can get it set up, we'll have it set up for SFM. It's so big and so heavy. If we set it up, we're likely to set it up outside between the ministry center and the little shed, because it would take up all this room in here. So we'll see about setting that up. The other up there is a ballista, which is really a gigantic crossbow. You crank it with a hand crank, and that pulls a whole bed backward on a ratchet and pole system. It clicks back, it locks in place, and it's got a sear, a trigger, you release that and it fires a 4-foot-long bolt, that is anti-personnel. In other words, it's intended to kill people, whereas the catapult was mostly for hitting buildings and walls and like that. So, and the catapult could throw rocks. Incidentally, the ancients did know something about biological warfare because they would sometimes throw dead cows into cities in the hopes that people would get sick. And they would often try to poison water sources. So that they did know about that kind of thing too. Some of the machinery that was used, those kinds of things in warfare, again, are staggering. They could throw a 250-pound, they would round off the rocks. They could throw a 250-pound rock, I think 300 yards. So it was a huge machine, and you know, they're very capable. Any questions? Yes?
That armament seems pretty hefty. Would that be able to pierce that soldier's armor?
Good question. So the question is, could that Roman bronze arrowhead pierce the Lorica segmentata? I'm not sure if it could or not. Maybe at super close range, but I think that the armor is fairly accurate. It's pretty heavy gauge, and I don't know. Now, if you could, you'd look for a chink in the armor. You know, so when the guy raises his arm, in fact, that's in the Bible. Remember that? Somebody got shot in the joint of his armor. So, rough estimate, I'd say no. I don't think it could get through under normal conditions. Any other questions?
Just a comment, when you sit and hear about this and just think about it, and the strategy that they put into this, and just such war machine.
So, you know, when I was a kid, you think about war and you think, oh, that's so neat and it's glorious, and then as you get older and you see some videos, and then you talk to people who have served in combat, and you think, ugh, that is ugly, it is horrible, it leaves such scars on people. Can you imagine in Ukraine, farmers going out in their fields, if this thing ever gets settled, farmers going out in their fields 20 years from now, and their tractor drives across a landmine? Good grief. So the more that I think about it, the more I think, when the king comes, the millennial kingdom, oh, no more war. When the king comes, it's going to be right. But until then, we got what we got. Any other comments, questions?
Well, the Romans fired flaming arrows.
Yes, yes.
With their catapults, did they fire any pyrotechnic?
So there is a phenomenon called Greek fire, and I can't remember now when it was developed, but there does, I think I'm remembering, there are historical records in ancient days of the ability to throw incendiary devices. So the short answer, I think, is yes.
I think the Greek fire also was primarily a naval weapon.
Yeah, correct. Yep, yep. And that might have been a later development, the formula for that, but I can't remember for sure.
That was a sticky substance. Like
It was kind of like napalm, yeah. Tar and so on, yeah. Anything else? Take your prayer bulletins, please, and we'll take a few minutes.